Shireen is currently working at Boeing subsidiary Aurora Flight Sciences as a systems engineer on electric and autonomous aircraft programs. Shireen's breadth of STEM experiences range from space debris mitigation and policy to collaborations with the European Space Agency on bioastronautics and with the FAA and NASA on model-based systems engineering-enabled certification, streamlining for noise and electric propulsion. As a multicultural and queer woman of color, Shireen is passionate about leading and supporting sustainable improvements of diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM. She's currently a DEI chair for Women of Aeronautics and Astronautics under AIAA, the world's largest aerospace professional organization, and has held leadership positions at the Society of Women Engineers at Georgia Tech. Shireen obtained her master's in aerospace engineering at Georgia Tech in the United States and her bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Trinity College Dublin in Ireland. Today, she continues to work towards normalizing a safe and welcoming industry-wide culture that empowers minorities to reach their full potential. Welcome, Shireen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So if it's all right with you, I'd love to jump into the meat of what we're discussing. The first one being rediscovering sources of validation and contentment that are disconnected from one's career. I would love for you to tell me about when you first realized that this was necessary to do and why it was required.
Yeah, so I think for me, the turning point was really graduating from my master's degree because I went straight from undergrad to master's. So for me, that was a 7.5-year journey. And for all of those 7.5 years, I had exams, projects, and then I went straight into internships for a lot of my summers. So pretty much the primary source of validation I had was exam grades or like performance reviews at internships, group projects, and the results of that. And my contentment also kind of came from the same places because I was very focused on my career. And if I ever had, some downhill moments, I focused on just bringing those back up to where I expected them to be. And I never really looked outside of that circle. I did have hobbies that I continued for maybe a few years at a time, but also I moved a lot. So keeping up a single hobby that was disconnected from my career wasn't really in the books. And when I graduated, which was about 6 months ago now, I finally now have a job where I get evenings and weekends off, and I don't have to think about my career, or I don't have to think about what I'm doing at work. And then I realized that I do have this long list of things that are supposed to give me validation or that are supposed to make me happy that I wasn't able to do before, and I have time to do now, but the happiness still wasn't coming. And that was because my brain was so programmed to only accept validation from career-related or academics-related things. And it has been, it still is a very up and down journey of reprogramming my brain to get happiness from things like, just painting, even though I'm not good at it anymore, trying new things like dance classes, cooking classes that have absolutely nothing to do with how well I'm doing at work.
Absolutely. So what does it now feel like for you to find these other sources of contentment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think at the start, it was a confusing feeling because for example, I took a dance class back in end of March, and taking a dance class has been on my list for probably all 7.5 years that I was in college. It's not something I've ever done before. I'm not good at it. So I went to this class. It just so happened that I was the only beginner there for this class, even though it was supposed to be a beginner's class. But so at the time I felt, a little bit embarrassed. I was kind of like, why am I doing this new thing when I should be getting happiness from things that I'm good at? But after the class, I felt it was rewarding that I did something new and I didn't have to be good at it. The teacher in the class didn't give me a low grade because I wasn't good at it. I was a beginner in a dance class. So I think after everything I've done, kind of the after effect of it has always been positive. And when I journal at the end of the week or sometimes at the end of the day, I always write down good things about it. But before going into the activity, I'm always apprehensive. So I think for me, it's kind of a mixture of those two feelings right now. And hopefully over time, I will also be excited and encouraged going into the activity rather than apprehensive and, continue the positive feelings after the activity as well.
Wow. So what was your process like in creating this list for yourself, especially when it feels so hard to decouple our self-worth from our productivity, especially when it comes to that feeling of productivity and the flow from submitting assignments and schoolwork? What was your process like in just coming up with a list like that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think some of the things on my list were there from before, like when I was an undergrad, for example, and maybe I would have friends who are doing these things. So one example is taking a pole dancing class. I haven't done that yet, but that has been on my list since I think it was like second year of undergrad, because I saw someone who would do it regularly. So some of these things are, examples like that, which I just put on my list on a whim, and now I finally have time to do it. There are other things that I consciously put on my list because I know that it is so far from my work and my career. And I also know that I enjoy doing it. So for example, hiking or getting outdoors, I've always enjoyed that. And I don't have that feeling of apprehension. So this is one of the activities where I'm like, okay, I know everything about it is positive. But also that kind of brings in the concept of location. So where I live right now, it's not the easiest to access hiking trails or get outdoors. So there is some work that goes into it. So to take like 3 trains or buses, and there is extra energy that goes into it. So I think my list right now is a combination of like conscious decisions of, okay, I know I love hiking and I'm ready to put in the extra hour on public transport that would take to get there, but also kind of more random things like pole dancing classes, which I saw someone else do. And that inspired me to kind of feel the same return or reward that I could see them feeling, and try and do those myself.
Absolutely. And so what I'm hearing is that it doesn't necessarily have to be a list that is constructed at the end of one's schooling years or at the end of a season of some sort. It can be an ever-growing, expanding, and evolving list that also grows with your perception of the world and what you find interesting and exciting and quirky even.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think a great example of that is my reading list. So I used to read a lot when I was younger, and it kind of dropped off essentially when I started college. So the books that I have on my reading list, some of them are still there from before when I started college, but I've added a lot more during the years. And after I graduated, I also added more, but the types of books that I've added have changed. So, fiction has always been there, but I've also been going more into nonfiction and like learning more about the world that I'm living in now, which wasn't really on the list before I started undergrad. So I think that has been a really interesting way for me to look at like how I've changed as a person through reading, which is an activity that doesn't necessarily connect to my career.
And I think that's so important because all of us have this ever expanding emotional support reading list or emotional support pile of books that we've purchased on a whim. And 100%. I think paying a nod to that, especially as we're growing up at this stage, is so important. Thank you so much for mentioning that. So if it's okay with you, I'd love to jump into the next topic, which is leveraging intersectionality to build meaningful connection. I was wondering if you just had anything else, any other lingering thoughts on the first topic that you wanted to share?
I think the only thing I would say is this is something that does require a lot of active work, or at least it has for me. So rediscovering those sources, if I had just left it and hoped it would happen over time, I think I would still be looking for validation from my career or my productivity. So it's just something that does require time and energy. And I think that's important to recognize when you're like at whatever turning point it is, to find these sources again. But yeah, that was really the last thing I would say.
So what I'm hearing is that anyone listening should really be patient with themselves and not underestimate the amount of intentionality it will take. And that even in rediscovering these other things, it can be a bit of hard work before it pays off its dividends and all the good feelings.
Yeah. 100%.
Okay. So in terms of leveraging intersectionality to build meaningful connection, I'd love for you to tell me and talk about accepting one's intersectionality, particularly about seeing yourself as being intersectional instead of one fitting into an identity or a box based on who is surrounding you, and who is accessible to you?
Yeah, for sure. So I think intersectionality means very different things for different people. And I think, as a singular person, there is a certain amount of intersectionality that your surroundings and like where you've grown up, what you've done, it kind of automatically gives you. But then it's kind of up to you to recognize all of that, as Ricky just said. So personally, for me, I was born in India. I moved to Ireland, which some of you might not know where that is. So it's the tiny little island that's floating beside the UK. And then I moved to France and the US for grad school. And all four of those locations had very different surroundings, very different people that I interacted with, different activities that I did. And I think for a really long time, I would say up until I was in undergrad or even the end of undergrad, I kind of just went with the flow. And I was like, yeah, I'm from two different places in the world. But I'd never really paid a lot of attention to what that meant for my performance in my academics, what I do for my hobbies, how I interact with people, how I plan my future. So I think towards the end of undergrad and especially in grad school, I started actually recognizing that intersectionality more, of being a brown woman who lived in Ireland, which is a pretty small country with a short immigration history. So there weren't a lot of people who looked like me or behaved like me around me for a long time. And then moving away again for grad school, moving into a community that was a lot more diverse than what I was used to in undergrad. So I think for me, accepting my intersectionality culturally has been really sitting down and reflecting on everything from, the political history of where I was born, India, to the one in Ireland, which is actually pretty similar when you look back at their colonial histories. Then, recognizing how big of a transition it was for me to move to France and then the US, and now kind of be in this middle ground of, I don't really know where I will be for the long term. Am I going to stay in the US? Am I going to go back to Europe? Everything that comes with that, like family, the logistics of living in different places, but also bringing in some of the other things that I count in my intersectionality, which is the different educational backgrounds I've had, my journey of figuring out that I'm queer, accepting that, and that again ties back into the culture. So being from an Asian demographic, the focus on academics, the focus on career has always been a huge part of my life. Accepting that I'm queer had a different layer of complexity to it coming from an Asian demographic. So personally for me, that journey is still going in terms of figuring out how all of these different aspects fit in together, kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, and how I can use them best to essentially build meaningful connections with other people and to plan my own life in the way that I see it as the best. That was a little bit of a roundabout way of answering a question, but feel free to ask more questions if I didn't answer everything.
No, that was perfect. And what I heard was that journaling and reflecting and even slowing down to recognize everything and to reflect was a really important part in breaking out of any of the boxes that you might have been put in. And my follow-up to that really is, how have you gone about breaking out of these boxes that you may have been put in to embrace intersectionality and everything that you are beyond journaling and reflecting? Are there any other tools in your toolkit you feel have been important as this process evolves and continues to unfold?
Sure, yeah. I think two main things come to mind. The first thing I would say is finding other people who also identify with the same identities that fall into my intersectionality. So whether that's being a brown woman who was born in a different country to the one that they're living in now. I have a lot more friends now who identify with that than I did maybe like 10 years ago when I lived in Ireland. So finding that kind of community has really helped me see that I'm not the only one who's in this situation. And I think it's a very human reaction to feel more positive about yourself when you see other people going through the same things that you are. So I would say that is definitely one thing that has helped me kind of realize that the box that I'm in, a lot of other people are in as well. So it's, the feeling of being boxed in becomes a lot less intense when you realize that you're not alone. And the second thing I would say is actually sitting down and learning about history. So I think I mentioned it a little bit before, but also in addition to reflecting and journaling, which is more of a personal thing, I think actually like even Googling or like going to museums or reading about the history of my culture, but also about queer culture and how the history of queer culture has developed in my home country, compared to how it has developed to where I live now or where I've lived before. And when I was younger, I never really liked history because of the way it was taught in schools. You know, we'd have to learn keywords and write essays. And most of the history I personally learned was kind of European history or Western history. But as I started learning more about Indian history and going back to my culture, and now more recently, I've started going to more LGBTQ plus events and learning about the movements in history that bring the culture to what it is today. I think that has also really helped. So depending on what your interests are and what you want to find out more about, I think learning a goal was also really helpful for me.
I think that's really wonderful. And the way that I'm visualizing all of this is really mapping out everything that you are and more, sort of like drawing out these different boxes and not just having one. And then I think finding communities in all of these spaces. So not just finding an Indian community or an international community or a queer community, but to find all of them and then to find the people that overlap across those communities is really special in building those meaningful connections that you're talking about, I believe.
Yes, absolutely. You got it right.
And I think what has been challenging is the fact that COVID has restricted so much of that community building. And I think that it's important to reach out to people over any sort of online platform as well, if you're seeking that connection. And even if you can't meet face to face, if you know that they belong to and identify as part of a certain community that you're looking to build meaningful connections in, just to reach out and to say hi and just to even have a online virtual connection, I think is really important in making you feel seen and represented in that area of your life, so that we're not suppressing any of these buckets, and that we feel like we can live authentically across all of these buckets.
100%.
So that really leads well into the last topic, which is both giving and receiving effectively within the right community. So we've spoken about what building the right community means for you. And I want to talk a little bit about how you've been able to give to your community whilst also maintaining the boundaries that you need to continue giving.
Yeah, for sure. So I think just going very quickly back to your point about online interactions, I think for me, this entire journey of, finding community had really started online after undergrad. So when I started grad school, the pandemic came pretty quickly after. And I would just emphasize what Ricky said about the fact that online interactions have been made a lot more commonplace now, just from the work culture that we've had over the past few years. So take advantage of that for sure. And just honestly cold message people. And you just need one response to find a point of contact, often to a much bigger community that person might have access to. So in answer to your question, I would say giving to my community has changed a lot in the past few years for me. So in undergrad, the way I would give to community would be mostly through mentorship that is related to engineering or related to the academics that I was doing. So, it would be like me maybe working with a younger undergrad to help them with a class. So it was very academics focused, and it was difficult for me to find ways to give back to the community that related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, just because of the way that my undergrad was set up and kind of a lack of already established communities where I could participate in. Coming into grad school, I think I walked into a culture that has more of those established groups, but that I also felt I was at a better point in my life where I could create these communities for myself if I wanted to, or if I had the resources to. So personally for me in grad school, I got involved with a few organizations that work with minority groups in STEM. And that was really the turning point for me to kind of understand tangible ways of giving back. So whether that is conducting online events, panels, talks that bring the voices of minority groups to a larger platform. And now again, in-person events, which is great. And also in a kind of closer group within my degree, working with people who identify with the same minority groups as I did. So whether that's international students, people of color, kind of people going through the same things that I was going through trying to get this degree. So I think in terms of giving back to my community, it's really been a journey of figuring out time in my schedule to do the things that I want to do while prioritizing my personal goals. So for me during the degree, it was like, not failing my exams, doing my projects and like getting the degree. And the first thing I had to do was schedule time out for that. But I also, on top of that, made it an almost equal priority to do the work that I was doing with the organizations. And I think it's very important to realize that that can go up and down. So in the last few months before graduation, I essentially just disappeared off of the face of the earth for some of those projects, but I just made sure to tell the people I was working with that I would be less available. So I think open communication channels and just making sure that everyone around you knows what your priorities are and what you need at the moment is essential to continue giving in the right way and also maintain your boundaries, as you were mentioning.
Absolutely. And in all of this and doing all the things that you are doing, what have you learned about asking for help in this community, which is respectful to both parties?
Absolutely. So I think on a very similar note, keeping the communication open, both in terms of, so when you're asking for help for someone, make sure that they know you're not demanding it. I think there's a very specific way of asking that makes it a difference between demanding and asking respectfully. And always keep in mind that this person also has their own lives and probably things that they are struggling with, just like you are, and that helping you is essentially a favor that they would be doing, especially if it's a one-way thing. And similarly, when someone is asking you for help, make sure that they know what you're prioritizing. So for example, if you get a message or an email, maybe just reply to them saying, oh, I'm busy for a couple of weeks because I have a really big project coming up, or I'm, taking some time off, and then make sure that they know when you will respond to them. So again, I think really communication and being honest about when you can help them or what kind of help you're asking for is really what you have to consider.
I think that's super important. And I'm so grateful that you mentioned all of those things so that people both feel supported and can give the support that they need in a kind way that respects everyone's boundaries, especially as so many people who are intersectional in these communities find themselves feeling stretched so thin across all of the ways that they're giving back. Okay, so if it's all right with you, I'd love to jump into the final set of questions, which is somewhat of a rapid fire, but if you need to take any longer for anything, feel free to do so. So my first question is, what does wellness mean to you?
I think wellness is essentially being kind to yourself and realizing that if you don't feel good, that's okay. Just taking time to figure out how you can feel good again.
I love that. So what does effective leadership mean to you?
Effective leadership, I would say, is being able to recognize the weaknesses and strengths in other people and tailoring your communication to those weaknesses and strengths, whether that is speaking in a different way or using maybe a little bit of a different personality when you're speaking to that person. So really, I think it's tailoring the way you talk to people.
Recognizing who the person is in front of you and really seeing them.
Yeah.
That is so important. So my next question is, can you tell me a bit about your morning and or night routine and what helps you bounce back when you fall off track?
So my routines I'm still figuring out because I think both of my routines when I was in college was just go to sleep when I can and then wake up and try to be a normal person when I can. But right now in the mornings, I have lemon and honey water that is heated up a little bit, and that has really changed the way I feel about the day because it kind of centers me and just gives me at least 2 minutes of focusing on one specific task. And I also work out relatively regularly in the morning right now. My night routine is still a little bit up and down. I try and do some reading at least 3 days a week before I go to sleep. In terms of bouncing back, I think exercise has really helped me. So the more consistent I can be with exercise, the more sane I feel on a daily basis.
I love that. So those were all my questions. I was wondering if there was anything else that you would like to share, any other lingering thoughts?
No, nothing else. I just want to say thank you for doing the work you're doing, and I'm very honored to be on this conversation with you.
Absolutely. So how can the audience members best reach you, follow you, and continue to learn from you on your journey?
Absolutely. So I am on LinkedIn and I'm on Instagram as well. I don't post that often, but it's just my name at Shireen Datta. And LinkedIn, if you look up my name as well, you should be able to find me. I'm also reachable by email. So shireen.datta@gmail.com. Yeah, and I would love to hear from anyone who wants to reach out, collaborate on anything, or just talk about random things. I love talking about random things. That's all.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining me, Shireen. Everyone in this community is so lucky to hear your story. And I hope that all of your tips and just all the pain points that you experienced and navigated gets to really sink in for them, so that if anyone is struggling with any of the same things, they can try some of the things that you've shared.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ricky.
Bye.
Bye.